Hi, I'm Mike Bird, and welcome to another episode of the Nazareth to Nicaea podcast and vodcast, the program where we look at all things about the historical Jesus, the Christ of faith, and the genuine development of Christology in the context of antiquity. In this episode, I'm talking to Professor Matthew Lynch of Regent College in Vancouver in Canada, and we're going to explore some facets of monotheism. Now, Professor Lynch is very much qualified to speak on this topic because he's written several very important books and articles on the topic of monotheism. And you'll see us discuss things like, is the word monotheism the right word to describe Israel's ancient religion? We'll go through all the issues about the origins and the possible development and or evolution of monotheism within Israel. We're going to focus on some particular texts, particularly in the book of Isaiah, but we'll also talk about a little bit of archaeology, things such as, figurines and the Elephantine papyri, and we finish off with some references to what this might mean for the development and the origins of Christology in the first century. So I hope you like that. This will conclude our monotheism section. And yeah, you're all set for a good episode, so please listen in and enjoy. Hello, I'm Mike Bird, and I'm talking to Professor Matthew Lynch from Regent College. Matt is a professor of Old Testament and Hebrew Bible, and he has a speciality in the study of monotheism. Matt, great to talk to you.
Good to speak with you, Mike.
Yeah, and how is life up in Canada?
It's rainy as ever, but that doesn't stop us from getting outside. So yeah, things are going well here.
Okay, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. Well, we're talking on the topic of monotheism, and I've got to share something with you. Okay, I was in church the other day, as I do, and we were going through Second Kings, and I came across this incredible line about the healing of Naaman the Syrian, by Elijah, and it said, Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant. Now that sounded like Naaman was saying, look, there's no other gods. Basically what we do is a fraud. You guys have the real deal. Okay, your God seems to be the only God because he got healed. Now, the problem I read a lot of scholarship, and people are telling me that Israel's religion was not monotheistic. I mean, the word I hear being used a lot is a thing called henotheism, where one God is just, maybe the God over a bunch of tribal gods. And there's all these really complicated technical debates about monotheism in ancient Israel, in the Persian and Hellenistic period, and then the Roman period during the time of Jesus and the apostles. And people are talking about, little miniature figurines. And did Yahweh ever have a wife? And, what's the difference between Baal and Yahweh? And there's this Elephantine papyri. I never knew how elephants could read or write papyri. But, there's all these complicated debates. Matt, could you tell us what is the story of Israel's monotheism? Is this like a late development that happened, very later in the Maccabean period, or was it always a monotheistic period? I mean, what's the story of monotheism in ancient Israel?
Yeah, answering that is a really complex task, as a lot of these debates are. And even your framing of the question sort of set it up in terms of historical issues, like stuff behind the Bible, like what are the conditions on the ground in ancient Israel that might have lent it to, monotheistic types of worship or not. There are terminological debates about whether monotheism is an anachronistic term that we shouldn't use for talking about ancient Israel or any of the Old Testament for that matter. And then there are textual issues regarding whether, apart from whatever your average Israelite believed, did the writers of the Hebrew Bible hold to a kind of monotheistic belief? And if so, at what time? Is this a thoroughgoing thing or not? So really all of those pieces are up for debate and discussion within scholarship, and they have been hashed over quite a bit. So some people are really interested in the origins and development of monotheism. So they're taking it for granted that Israel did become monotheistic. So setting aside the sort of debates about terminology. And they're wondering, okay, when is the moment when that happened? So, maybe, I don't know if this is the case in New Testament studies, I'm sure it is. But there's that sort of love of like finding the moment when a belief took shape. And if you can find that moment, somehow you get at the essence of the thing. And so people will talk about like, when did the monotheistic breakthrough happen? Did it happen during the reign of Hezekiah or Josiah, or during the exile when Israel was suddenly confronted with all of these powerful Babylonian deities? And really any number of ideas have been espoused. So all the way from sort of William F. Albright's conviction that monotheism is very early in Israel, or at least quasi-monotheistic belief goes back to the Mosaic period. And then others who think, no, it took shape during the exile, when life was so disrupted that they had to sort of rethink their commitments to Yahweh. And is this God more powerful than the Babylonian gods, or do they even hold any power? And then others will say, no, it's much later, even in the Persian Hellenistic period, when this took shape, when, I don't know, certain forms of philosophical reasoning became more prevalent. So really the span for when monotheism took shape that have been proposed is about 1200 to 1000 to 1200 years in range. So there's, and then also within that, there's discussions about, did monotheism evolve? In other words, did it sort of did Israelite religion start out like its neighbors, sort of polytheistic, and then the pantheon got reduced down to God and Yahweh and his wife, and then eventually Yahweh shed his wife along the way? This is from the sort of Israelite point of view. And you eventually had just one God for us, and then eventually one God in existence. So that's what I would call, and others have called, an evolutionary view, where it sort of slowly took shape over time and is moving generally in one direction, and toward monotheism. And once Israel got there, they sort of never turned back. And so that's like the, I don't know if you want me to sort of spell out more within those discussions about the development of monotheism, but that's the sort of general kind of big picture historical questions that are involved. And then there are all the textual and terminological debates too.
Well, I probably should ask, what is your view of this debate? Because I mean, there are a whole bunch of different views. I mean, some people, I think, like William Albright, said no, it was kind of monotheistic to begin with. Growing up in a polytheistic, all the way through to, you don't really get to monotheism until the 1st century. And then there's some people who think that that monotheism is just completely the wrong word, always and all the time, and we should just get rid of it and abandon it completely. So what's, I mean, given all these debates about, the Canaanite religious culture, influence from Egypt, the archaeology, like I said, everything from figurines to the odd inscription that we find. What's your debate on, I mean, on Israel's, religion? Did it develop? Did it crystallize? Is monotheism a latecomer on the scene? I mean, because you've written extensively on this, Matt. So what's your particular view?
Yeah, and where I've written is more on the text side of things, and not so much the archaeological and historical developmental side. The one thing I'll say on historical development is that I think I think it's very difficult to say that Israel was um, moving slowly and inexorably toward one thing. I think it really does a disservice to the complexity of how religions tend to move and develop and devolve and evolve and move sideways and whatnot. So I think that, I mean, Akhenaten is an interesting case in Egypt, where you had a sort of monotheistic religion in the 14th century BCE, and after Akhenaten, they went right back to polytheism. So there's nothing about monotheism that means you can't ever go back. Um, the other thing I'll say historically is that I think we see across the biblical traditions in the Old Testament a, a range of ways of monotheizing that complicate any effort to plot all of those in a neat developmental path. And so my main sort of, if I had a historical argument, it's that you can't chart a trajectory. So you can't say, was Israel monotheistic in the late monarchic period? Because it depends on which Israelite you're asking, which biblical writer you're asking. There's a complex range of beliefs that were held, and also ways of expressing, of monotheizing. But the other thing I'll say is that I'm not of the opinion that monotheistic rhetoric is this sort of like light dusting on the cake that's of a Bible, of a Hebrew Bible that's otherwise thoroughly monolatrous or henotheistic. In other words, like believing that, Yahweh's the one for us, and other nations have their legitimate gods, and that's fine. So, yeah.
Now, in terms of monotheistic rhetoric, I know you've written in particular on the monotheistic rhetoric of Deutero-Isaiah. Okay, that's the central sections of Isaiah, where you really do get these fairly dramatic and almost grandiose acclamations by God that I am God and there is no other, which people could take to think that it's teaching an absolute metaphysical monotheism. Even though other parts of the wider book talk about the various gods of the Babylonians and all the other local tribes. How then do you see the monotheistic rhetoric of Isaiah fitting in, given if it's not just a light dusting or a kind of bit of hyperbole, okay, for a sort of a tribal henotheism, if it's more than that, how do you see the theism of Isaiah fitting into this sort of this panorama of Israel's ancient religion?
Well, if I could simplify, so Isaiah 1 to 39 are generally associated with the Assyrian period, before the South went into exile, and the Isaiah 40 to 55 are generally associated with the Babylonian period, and that's where you have the I am and there is no other stuff is in 40 to 55. And interestingly, it's more restricted than that. It's really in chapters 40 to 48. So you get this like slim section of one prophetic book where you get all this rhetoric, I am and there is no other, concentrated in one place, and then it sort of disappears from the rest of the book. So to me, that clues us in that we're dealing more with a rhetorical moment than we are with a religious realization or philosophical abstraction of some kind. They're confronting Babylonian claims to supremacy. And in fact, in Deutero-Isaiah, we also have Babylon claiming, I am and there is no other. So Yahweh's claim to supremacy is being set in relation to Babylon's own claims to supremacy. So you're dealing more with like a contest of imperial powers than you are with religious theorizing. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Also in Zephaniah, Nineveh claims I am and there is no other. So this is, you have to press into that and say, what does it even mean to say, I am and there is no other? Is Babylon claiming that no other cities exist? According to Isaiah, I don't think so. I think it's a claim to sole power and control and authority. And on the Yahweh side, that that claim I am and there is no other, if you were to sort of add a ... there, it's saying there is no other deliverer. In fact, one text in Isaiah even says that there is no other deliverer. So it's what Nathan MacDonald calls a soteriological monotheism, that Yahweh is the only one who can save. And I would add to that and say there's an epistemological monotheizing rhetoric happening in Deutero-Isaiah, where Yahweh says, I'm the only one who can tell you what is to come, not your idols. So Yahweh knows the future and can deliver. So those are the specific claims being made there. So when you drill into the so-called monotheistic rhetoric in a place like Deutero-Isaiah, you see that they're really specific claims being made. And yes, they are a form of monotheizing, like asserting Yahweh's categorical supremacy, but with respect to certain things. And I think that's important. And if I could back it up, in Isaiah 1-39, there's a very different form of monotheizing happening. And it's not really sort of moving towards second Isaiah. It's just a different way of expressing Yahweh's sole supremacy. And it works in a really different way. So there's so I've talked about this in a book I wrote on first Isaiah, where first Isaiah focuses on the spatial supremacy of Yahweh. It uses sort of all this up and down language. So Yahweh alone is exalted on high, and everything else is rendered low and made low. And first Isaiah pretty much refuses to use the term Elohim, that gets translated God or gods, in reference to other nations' divinities. So there are at least 5 cases where first Isaiah quotes from other texts, but swaps out a different term for Elohim. And in fact, first Isaiah seems to make up its own term as a sort of mocking of the very premise of, nations calling their deities Elohim. So it uses Elilim, which is like fraud gods. So first Isaiah develops its own way of monotheizing. Second Isaiah has its rhetorical moment. And you can see the difficulty of just plotting these on a trajectory in one direction. I think instead what we see across the Bible is various ways, and sometimes disconnected ways, but a pervasive tendency to assert Yahweh's sole supremacy. And to me, that's the common denominator across large sections of the Hebrew Bible, but not every section.
Yeah, so what I find is that Yahweh is not the only deity, spiritual being, angel, heavenly power around, but he is kind of described as having supremacy in some cases, unrivaled supremacy. And certainly when you get into apocalyptic literature, that becomes even more accented or more acute. But two things come out of that. If that is the case, do we still talk of monotheism, or should we find another term like henotheism? Or I've heard one scholar talk about sumo-deism. I mean, there's hypertheism, and there's all these terms. Should we be scrubbing out the word monotheism and finding some sort of replacement that people are charging, given that there is a heavens populated with various powers, deities, angelic forces, and Yahweh is said to be supreme within them? I mean, or do we simply give an adjective to monotheism? I think I read somewhere about the term monarchical monotheism, where there are other deities, and yet Yahweh is simply supreme because he is God of gods and Lord of lords. What's your take? Should we be keeping the word monotheism?
Yeah. So I'm a fan of keeping the term, but letting the text sort of help us fill out the meaning of that term. So when you're doing study of religion, any term you bring to the table is to some extent anachronistic. And that would go for henotheism, monolatry, sumo-deism, cathenotheism.
What the heck is that? What's cathotheism?
So that's the belief.
Is that the worship of Catholics?
Yeah. Well, it's the belief in only one God at a time. So whatever God you happen to be worshiping is the supreme deity at that time, and it's a term I think it's used with in analysis of Hinduism. So
I'd call that monotheistic monogamy, just one God at a time.
yeah, serial or
Yeah, maybe I should write
serial
an article
polygamy.
on that. I'll write an article for the Journal of Religion and
Yeah,
Method
yeah,
on why we should. I'll invent the term monotheistic monogamy,
yeah,
or yeah, we'll see how we
yeah,
are.
or
Probably won't
serial
take it.
polygamy. Yeah.
Yes.
So um, so I think it's important to just recognize that our terms fall short, and then so that's why I like the word monotheizing to get at least the rhetoric that we see in Scripture. Um, so I don't know what we can't get into the heads of biblical writers. Did the writer of Second Isaiah believe in the back of his mind, if you pushed him on like what he thinks about the nature of reality, that there are other spiritual beings populating the heavens? He might have said yes, of course, but like my point here is that Yahweh is unrivaled in his ability to save and know the future. um, all we have is not all we have, but to a large extent what we have is the claims of the text. And so I like monotheizing because it gets at that impulse to assert stridently the categorical supremacy of Yahweh. Now, the reason I would push back against like whether monarchic monotheism really suits is that some texts leave no space for other divine beings, um, give them no airtime. And so like take Genesis 1 sort of paints the divine beings out of the picture, or relegates them to just the natural world. Other texts do the same, and then other texts bring them in quite happily because they augment God's supremacy.
Yeah.
So when you have a gigantic entourage worshiping Yahweh full-time, 24-hour days, 24 hours a day, all throughout the year, that's only a bolster to how great and wonderful God is. So you can see how both sort of rhetorical systems are doing something similar, but in very different modes of engagement with respect to the other divine beings that fill the heavenly realm. So yeah, I'm fine with it. And I think one thing that gets missed in the discussion sometimes is how anachronistic other terms are too. So I think people think like, oh, monolatry, that really rescues and is more descriptive. But that helps get at the fact that a lot of these so-called monotheistic texts are trying to persuade Israel that Yahweh is the only one they should worship or give loyalty to. Okay, so it does that positive work, but it does nothing in terms of the claims that Yahweh is also supreme over all other reality. So monolatry falls real short on that front, as does henotheism. And as you probably know from studying the New Testament, like take a term like atheism, means something very different in a first century context, when Christians are accused of being atheists. Has a very different balance to it than we would think about today. So and I think like the purist tendency to say, oh look, they believed in other divine beings over here, so they must not be monotheistic, misses how we even use the word today, because Christians generally believe in a very populated heaven, and that is not seen to really compromise monotheism.
Yeah, I mean that's what I've always found interesting. People say, well, monotheism is inappropriate because there was various divine beings and heavenly creatures, but Muslims also believe in various angels and spirits, but no one calls Muslims henotheists or anything like that. And Catholics have the various martyrs and saints in addition to angels and that type of thing, but no one says Catholics are basically polytheists or anything along those lines. I mean, my thinking is that when you get the emphasis on on Israel's God as unrivaled and
Hmm.
supreme,
Hmm.
if he is kind of like, in his own class, as it were, it's only a very short step to using the language that there's no one in his class, therefore there is no one who is a God like him, and
Right.
there is no God beside him. So
Yeah.
I mean, that's my understanding. So the idea of an absolute metaphysical monotheism, whereby
Hmm.
Yahweh is like the only God,
Hmm.
that makes sense if he's being put in a class
Hmm.
way above and beyond others, and he
Hmm.
really has no rival, and no one's in danger of kind of breaking the ceiling that separates him from all of the other created entities.
Yeah, I think, and one of the sort of diagrams I've drawn in a couple of different articles is basically you have Yahweh above and supreme in all terms of engagement, and then sort of a line and beneath Yahweh could be, on the one hand, could be no other divine being, so that would be this sort of monotheistic rhetoric that empties the heavens, so to speak, at least for that rhetorical moment. And then on the other hand, you might have underneath that line many divine beings who are worshiping Yahweh or giving praise or carrying out Yahweh's orders, and both of those can be ways of monotheizing because they are asserting that categorical supremacy.
Yeah, I think that's a good term. It's a monotheism of categorical supremacy, and
Mhm.
nobody is in his league, as it were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I would add there that there are some texts in the Bible that either do not seem to hold to that view. So I don't think it's a zero sum game. Like if you believe in different forms of monotheizing, that you have to claim every text in Hebrew Bible is equally monotheistic. And I think there are a lot of texts that are just underdetermined. And so, like in the Ten Commandments, you shall have no other gods beside me. Um, Now, does the writer believe that those other gods exist or not? Well, maybe some, I don't know how Israelites would have received that. I'm sure some of them would have understood that to mean there should be no other gods in God's cultic presence, no other deities in the temple. And others would have believed that, well, of course you can't have other gods before Yahweh because they don't exist.
Yeah.
So they're underdetermined, and they can function within a monotheistic system, but they don't necessarily need to. And I think we have to allow for that.
Okay, excellent. But as you point out, people want to go through some of the more ambiguous texts or some of the more
Mhm.
ambiguous and contested pieces of evidence to suggest that the practice, dare I say, the lived version of ancient Israelite religion was never really monotheistic. And something that comes up time and time again is the Elephantine papyri, which is the literary remains and residue of a Jewish garrison in Persian Egypt, where basically it seems to be something like a mercenary colony, or
Mhm.
Jewish conscripts or soldiers who are garrisoning this kind of island in, I think, in the Nile or
In the
somewhere
Nile.
along
Yep.
there, and they had their own little worship mall where they had a temple of Yahweh, but a whole bunch of other temples,
Right.
and that they're writing some to the temple in Jerusalem about permissions about certain things, and they're getting
Mhm.
dialogue. How does the Elephantine papyri figure into our discussion of monotheism?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to say on that front, except that it's a reflection of the fact that in the Persian period, there is still a range of belief among Jewish people about how to express um, the nature of Yahweh and Yahweh's relationship to other deities, because it seems to have been what we would call probably a syncretistic form of Yahwism, merging with other deities that were neighboring in the vicinity of this Yahweh temple in Elephantine. So I think um, again, like, this complicates that evolutionary view that sees a sort of slow and steady progress toward monotheism that settles down and is fixed by the Persian period. Um, and And what's interesting too in the Persian period is that there were other Yahweh temples around. So there was a Yahweh temple in Samaria. There's a hints of one in Idumea as well, and so and of course one in Jerusalem. So there, even the cultic shape that Yahwism should take at that time was contested, let alone the expression of Yahwism and what that should look like. So these things are all still being negotiated and worked out, even in the Persian early Hellenistic period too.
Okay, excellent. That's a good way of putting it. It goes to show that it's not a straight out
Mm-hmm.
evolution. And obviously the practice of religion tends not to be so kind of neat,
Yeah.
uniform.
Yeah.
You can people doing things which by later standard
Yeah.
would be considered, either unorthodox or
Yeah.
nonconformist.
And that's the other, if I could just add one thing there, is, a lot of people talk about monotheism's entailments, like what does it involve with it? Like prohibition on magic. Does it involve the prohibition on images? And a lot of people collapse those two things. Like if you find an image, it means they're not monotheistic, or monotheism means you won't find images. And neither of those things are necessarily the case. So like there's some interesting hints in like Persian period strata in Jerusalem that Judean pillar figurines are still hanging around, and it's not clear if they're still in use or being manufactured, but they're around, and at least in Persian period trash piles, and coins with images on them, sometimes of Yahweh even. So the idea that monotheism is also going to result in certain things needs nuance as well.
Okay. Well, Matt, I'm primarily a New Testament scholar, so I'm as much as I love Moses and the prophets, I'm rather keen on Jesus. As we come to the New Testament period, the first century, what is the main relevance of monotheism for how we understand Christology? Now, I understand this is not your primary area of expertise, and we've got some good friends of yours like Chris Tilling who have their own opinions on this, but just as an Old Testament scholar who looks in the cubicle next door, where the New Testament scholars are kind of playing with their Play-Doh and everything. What's the relevance of monotheism for the way we talk about Christology? Do you have anything you want to share on that?
Well, I mean, I would say that the discussions about monotheism in Christology have been helpful for me for thinking about the Hebrew Bible and kind of jolting me out of some of the like preconceived ideas I had regarding the Old Testament. But I think being alert to the idea that first of all, monotheism doesn't need to just refer to a philosophical abstraction of some kind. It can be a pattern of rhetoric that we see emerging in praise and in liturgical texts. So being keyed into those sort of patterns of claiming certain things about Yahweh in the first century, and whether those also show up in reference to Jesus, I think is really interesting. And I'm not sure I have a lot to add to that discussion, but I think it's important. And as my colleague Chris Tilling has also talked about, like patterns of relating to Yahweh also becoming characteristic of patterns of relating to Jesus. And I think it'd be interesting to look at like the degree to which those patterns of relation are rooted in texts that make those assertions about Yahweh's categorical supremacy. So yeah, those are a couple of areas, and I'm sure your listeners are familiar with the ways that Christology has attended to both Yahweh's unique deeds, unique patterns of devotion related to Yahweh and how they're applied to Jesus, and then those patterns of relationship. I think those are all, areas of relevance.
Okay, excellent. And if you had to recommend one good article to read on monotheism,
Mhm.
and maybe one of your own works for people coming to this topic, do you have anything you could
Mhm.
recommend for us, Matt?
Well, I mean, Nathan McDonald, who was my supervisor in my postdoc in when I was in Göttingen in Germany, who's now at Cambridge, his book on Deuteronomy and the meaning of monotheism has been really influential on me and helpful to a lot of people. And that's really a critique of monotheism. So you might be surprised to hear me recommending it, because he's kind of doing a demolition job on the way that monotheism has been used, but I think it's a necessary one. And he focuses in on how these claims about Yahweh's about soul devotion to Yahweh alone and so on in Deuteronomy that are often taken in abstract terms are really about that sort of relationship and exclusivity to Yahweh. So his book's really influential and helpful. Before we went live here, we talked about Benjamin Summer, and the end of his book on the bodies of God has a big section on monotheism. I found that helpful. And then I wrote an article called Mapping Monotheism, and that's in Vetus Testamentum. So that might be a place people could go. I think it's available on my academia page.
Excellent. Well, that is
Mm-hmm.
terrific. Well, Matt, thank you for sharing with us on the topic of monotheism. It's probably a lot more complicated than many people think, and we've only just sort of scratched the surface on this. But I think people are going away more fully formed, more fully understood of what the debates are, and some of the solutions that are being proffered by scholars such as yourself. So thank you very much for your time, Matt.
Sure thing, Mike. Thanks for having me.
No worries. I'll catch you around, and I'll see you. Hopefully I'll see you around at SBL or somewhere like that, Matt.
That sounds
Otherwise,
good.
take care and enjoy all that free healthcare in Canada.
I will. Thanks.
Okay, see you, Matt.
See ya.